war.
Recording in progress.
If it's an obligatory war, so then how come? How can the? I'm sorry, not it's obligatory war. It's a mechemes rishus, as Rashi explains. It's an optional war. The Rebbe goes on in the middle of explaining how necessary the war against the nafsh habahamis is, and therefore it doesn't fit with saying Kisei L'Melchama Oiviך as the war against nafsh habahamis, and at the same time calling it an optional war. So he's continuing in that idea of about this concept of the war with the nafsh habahamis. So he says that the nafsh habahamis has this flaming fire. The Yetzer Hara is a flaming fire, and just like the korbanos in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, we needed to elevate nafsh habahamis to its root in the fire of above to overcome that flaming fire of the taiva the nafsh habahamis has. And the Alter Rebbe continues. The line begins habahamis. I think it's 7 lines in the bottom. Mamshel levayer, and the Alter Rebbe continues to explain. Shebachol yom yitzri shalad miskaber olav. Every single day, the Yetzer Hara of a person tries to overcome him. V'tzarich b'chol yom lahamshich b'chinas eish l'mayla. The fire from heaven, just like in the Beis Hamikdash, the fire milmayla came down to be makar the korbanos every single day. The same thing every single day. We need to deal with the fire of the nafsh habahamis by bringing down the fire of above. If it says Yomim Yitzarum, that days were formed. Sheyesh mispar v'kitzva l'shnei chayei ha'adam. There's a number and a set amount to the years of a person's life. Like it says in Tillim, that our years of them are 70 and Gvurish, Moinim Shana. The Rebbe says it wasn't given for the Nefesh Elokis. The Nefesh Elokis doesn't need these years. The Neshama doesn't need to be repaired on its own. The number of the life of a person was given to enclose his nefesh habahamis. His years are set and established in the number that Hashem's wisdom had estimated that is able to handle, that how much is necessary lahalis memena kol kach koiches v'nitzutzim shenaflu shama b'shviras hakelim, top of page 81, that he is given a certain amount of time because he was designated a certain amount of sparks that fell down here, and those sparks need to be elevated, so he was given the amount of time necessary to be able to elevate those sparks. So it comes out again that his whole avoida is with the nefesh habahamis. The whole reason why he came down here is to deal with the nefesh habahamis. And a vital part of that begins and is the avodah of davening, where the person elevates nefesh habahamis and takes that fire nefesh habahamis and elevates it to the fire and overcomes it with the fire of above. So he says on the top of the page 281, so he concludes the question from yesterday, Valpiza Nimtza, according to this, it comes out. The war that's in the avodah of davening is a primary thing, it's a core thing. To such a degree, that is the goal of the whole idea of the descent of the neshama into the body. The neshama descended from a high building to a deep pit, a deep dungeon. So how is it possible, according to Pshutish Mikra, that Rashi explains that since it says Shavisa Shivyoi, that you will capture its captives, and the captives are only possible by Malchamas Rishush, because by Malchamas Mitzvah, by Malcham of the Shiva Umois, there is no captives, Leschai Kol Neshama. So how could you fit in the pshat of the Alter Rebbe, that Kisei L'Melchama Oiviך is talking about a war against who are your enemies. The enemy of a person is his nefesh habahamis in his body. And then you say, in Rashi, in the Pshut Mikra, that it's a Malchamas Rishus. This battle with the nefesh habahamis, this overcoming the nefesh habahamis, is not an optional thing. it's an obligatory thing. So the Rebbe is going to introduce that it's true, even though there is a case or there's a situation where it's obligatory, but that obligatory is at a certain stage in the person's avodah. There comes a level of his avodah where there is another way to deal with the nafsh habahamis. He's going to deal with the nafsh habahamis, but not in a way that davening does. He says in Ois Gimel, the idea behind this is Shagam lefi Pirish Rabbeinu Azok, and also according to the explanation of the Alter Rebbe, the Mashakos of the Kiseitz L'Malchama, Koy Al Malchama Shaboisat Tefillah. When it says when you go out to war, it's referring to the war in the avodah of davening. Efshel Lefarish, we could explain Kiseitz L'Malchama, K'may lefi Pirish Rashi. We could explain this according to Rashi's explanation that you will go out to war. Meloshen Im, that it's Shazo in Rishus. We said yesterday that the word ki seitze l'malchama, ki can be translated as when. So if it's an obligatory war, so then ki seitze l'malchama means when you will go out to war. But if it's an optional war, which is the way Rashi explains it, so the word ki is translated as im, as if you will go out to war. So how can that be? So he says, the fact that the avodah of davening, working with the nefesh habam, is trying to transform it, is an obligatory war by every single yid. That's only at the beginning of the person's avodah. But after the person already began his avodah, after he already started making inroads with his nefesh habahamis, it's possible to have two types of avodah, and both of them will impact his nefesh habahamis, but not necessarily in a way of a war. What's the two types of avodah? Torah tefillah, either Torah learning or davening. So the Rebbe is going to explain. It's explained in many places. There are two types, two approaches in refining the Yetzer Hara. You can war with the nefesh habahamis, you can fight with the nefesh habahamis, or you could overcome it in a peaceful manner. In general, which is called Shas Krova. In general, this is the difference between the avodah of davening, which davening is called, the Zohar calls it Shas Sloisa, Shas Krova. The time of davening is a time of battle. So davening is when we battle and fight with the nefesh habahamis. On the other hand, la'avodas Torah, as opposed to avodah Torah learning, that the shedracheha darchei noyam, its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are paths of peace, which means even in refining, even in dealing with the nefesh habahamis, it deals with it, but not in a way of a war. Behind this means avodah of davening is refining the Yetzer Hara from below to above. It's through the enclothing of the one who's refining the godly soul in the one that's being refined, which is the animal soul. That's why it's called Mamata L'Maila. He's engaging with him. He's dealing with him like a war. That the Alter Rebbe gives an example of two enemies that are like wrestling each other. They embrace and they engage with each other. And because of that, since the Nefesh Elokis is enclothing itself Nefesh habahamis and trying to work with the Nefesh habahamis, trying to change it, therefore the war has the engagement and the transformation comes through fighting and through toil and effort. But the refinement that comes about through Torah is from above to below. The Torah does not directly engage with the Nefesh habahamis. It deals with things that are prohibited. It deals with things that have to be shunted aside and Torah says this is prohibited, that's something you should avoid. But it doesn't engage with the Nefesh habahamis. As it's known, Torah is likened to bread from heaven. And we constantly have the concept, Mashamayim dibarti mochem, vayered Hashem al har Sinai. All these things are indicative of this nature of Torah, that Torah is about coming from above to below. And the way the birur comes when it's in a way of from above to below is b'derech mamela. It's in an automatic way. It's like Chassidim use the expression "choshech treibt nicht mit abbezen." You don't chase out darkness with a broom. Rather, if you turn on the light in a room, so the darkness dissipates, it disappears. Torah is like that light, Torah oir, and that makes that the darkness falls away automatically. How does that happen? Through Torah study, he draws down and reveals godliness in his nefesh. By Deizem, through that the Yetzer Hara becomes nullified, and the Yetzer Hara becomes refined through that Gilui Or. Based on this, we can understand why he said that tefillah is a rishus. It's a melchemes rishus. It's an optional war. According to this understood. Why refining the Yetzer Hara through war? That's the avoid of davening is called an optional war. Because there's a refinement in a way of rest through the avodah of Torah. So again, this is the Rebbe also says this is after the person did the obligatory wars, just like Begashmias. First, the Yidden had to get rid of the 7 nations before they went into optional wars, the Pashtas, simply put. The same thing, yes, the beginning of the Avodah, just learning Torah alone would not really be enough to deal with Nefesh Habahamis. But once he took on the Nefesh Habahamis, once he did the basic war against the Nefesh Habahamis with davening, so now he can take on the Nefesh Habahamis in a way of Mamayla Lamata, Min Hashemayim Dibarti Mochem, in a way of Torah. The Rebbe says this is also expressed at the conclusion of our parsha, when it talks about how there will be the relief of all the enemies around us. This is also what it says at the conclusion of the parsha. It will be when the Hashem will relieve you from all your enemies. Then there's no need for an idea of any type of war. But because Hashem relieved you, that He redeemed in peace my soul from those that battled me. It says that a sword will not pass through your land. Even a sword of peace, meaning they're not coming to fight you, they're peaceful with you, they just want to pass through to fight through a neighbor. When the Eibishter relieves you of all these enemies. In other words, when you have graduated to the next step, you have already done the avodah of davening. So then the avodah is in the way of rest. That's the manner of the avodah through limud Torah. Like many Maamar Chassidus speak about this idea about Padav Shalom Nafshi and so on. Look in footnote 24. That in footnote 24 he also mentions that these 2 types of avodah, the avodah of melchama and b'derech shalom, could be in Torah itself. Let's let's look down on footnote 24. Beprotius gam b'Torah yesh eitz hachayim v'ilona toivara. Also in Torah there's the tree of life, which is pnimius haTorah, which doesn't engage with the klippa, which is purely from above to below. It deals with holy things and spiritual matters and doesn't deal with the negatives of the world, doesn't deal with the klippa. And then there's the tree of good and bad, that's nigla the Torah, meaning because it deals and engages with things that have to do with the negative. This is prohibited, this is permitted, and so on. Another manner of a difference of b'derech menucha, b'derech melchama in Torah. Shas Yerushalmi v'shas Bavli. We always speak about in Chassidus the difference between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, that Yerushalmi was straight to the point. And that's why it's much shorter, not so much shaklavatari, not so much questions and answers. The Talmud Bavli, we say, he settled me in darkness, that there's a lot of questions and machlokes and so on. So Talmud Bavli, where there's all these questions that you have to overcome, so it's darkness, it's war, it's battle. But the Talmud Yerushalmi, it's straight, you get straight to the point very quickly. That is b'derech menucha, that's in the way of a rest, not in the way of a battle. Let's skip the parentheses. It says, "V'rei time ha'mitzvos la'arizal v'eschanam shar mitzvah sha'arizal hoyamakshe b'koyachulu." That the Arizal would ask questions with a lot of energy. Why? Because Eisik halacha k'dei l'shaber ha'klippa. Because the being involved in halacha and the nigla, that would break the klippa, because it was a way of fighting with the klippa, a melchama, but in the way it's in Torah, as we know the expression melcham to the Torah. Then the Rebbe says further that just like in Torah there is melchama and shalom itself, in davening also there's both. Ubetfila, tefillah the choil, the Shabbos, the tefillah of the weekday is more about battling than Nefesh Bahamis, whereas the tefillah of Shabbos is like it says, "V'karosel Shabbos oynig," you shall call Shabbos a day of the light. The light means that you're not engaging in the battle, you're just engaging and connecting with very high levels, and through that, the Nefesh Bahamis is becoming won over. Okay, back to the text itself, 2 lines from the bottom of the page. Now the Rebbe is going to say that there's still the 2 types of avodah, the avodah of Torah, which is considered a one way of dealing, in a way of peace, versus the avodah of tefillah, which is a war, but it's an optional war, since it can go with Torah, impact each other and influence each other. So it's the second line from the bottom, va'oid zois, in addition to this, shagam kashar nimtzoim b'mayim the matzav sheyesh tzorech b'inam l'chomesh b'voisat tefillah. Even in that first stage, when one is first initially dealing with his Yetzer Hara, that we said it's not sufficient just to do the avodah b'derech menucha with Torah. He doesn't have the option. The war is obligatory war. Hinei, second to the last page, 282, Limidat Torah. Shezoy avodah sheb'derech menucha. That is avodah. That's in the way of rest and comfort. Nas is gam avodas hatfilah b'ofen acher legamri. The peaceable nature of Torah, the menucha nature of Torah, the mamaylamata nature of Torah impacts that the davening is not to such a degree of battle. This means as follows. We see tefillah impacting Torah, as he's soon going to explain, and just like we see tefillah impacting Torah, Torah impacts tefillah as well. The Kishem Shemayla says, "B'Torah shachrat tefillah." Just like the advantage and quality of learning Torah after davening is higher than the Torah that we learn prior to davening. That's the idea that tefillah affects the Torah. Because when a person first connects himself with Hashem and has that bond with the Eibishter to such a degree, like Abba Binyamin said, "Shehei tefilasi smuchel mitasi," the first thing I do when I get up is I daven before learning, because then that ensures that the way I learn Torah is with bittul and so on, because it's been impacted by my tefillah beforehand. So just like the tefillah raises the Torah to a different level that follows it, the limudat Torah, in a similar vein, there's also the influence of Torah study over davening, that the davening becomes in a much higher way, that it also shares in this less type of battle and more in a way of peace and in the way of resolution with the Nefesh Bahamis instead of battling it. Now the Rebbe is going to connect all of this with the period of the year that we're standing in, the month of El. Oizdal. We can connect what we said before with the 2 types of avodah, of davening and learning, which is in a peaceful way of, or a war type of way of dealing with Nefesh Bahamis versus a peaceful way, with the idea of the month of El. Befrat al pi hayidua, especially according to what it's known. Shebedrush yachsid shel b'kutei Torah. The Maamar chsidus b'kutei Torah hinikvar beparshas Rei. Already in Parshas Rei, 2 parshas ago, Medubar Oidis in Yom Chodesh El Rei speaks about the matters of the month of El. So if so, as we go on with the Torah, for sure, it's going to be touching on El, whether he explicitly mentions it or not. How much more so is the Maamorim of Parshas Kiseitze, which Parshas Kiseitze is talking about the war of the Nafshalakis with the Nafshabahamis, etc. That's only optional, and so on. The idea behind this is the Niksiv, it says in the Pasuk, Anila doidi v'doidi, which is Rosh Tevis El, or Rei B'Shoshanim. I am to my beloved is to me, which is the acronym for Elul, the one who grazes amongst the roses. We know from the Maamar of the Alter Rebbe, the second Anila doidi, that there's 2 explanations in what it means, grazes amongst the roses, that he goes into pasture amongst the roses. Pirush Aleph, one explanation is Sheshana Yesh Bat Leisar Alin, that a rose has 13 petals, Keneged Yud Gimel Mechil and Rachman. It corresponds to the 13 attributes of mercy. V'hainu, this means, like what the Eitz Chaim says that we bring down in the first Anila Doidin Kudei Torah, Shebechodesh El Meirim Yud Gimel Misar Rachman. In the month of El, it shines the 13 attributes of mercy. The Inyan is Shaykh B'chlal Lavos Atfila. This is connected in general to Avodah of Davni. Upirish Abeis, and a second explanation is that Al Tikra Shoishanim El Shoshoinim. Do not read it Shoishanim, which is roses, but read it that they are learning, they are studying. Ba'oisam Shoshoinim B'Torah, those that are studying Torah, which is also has to do with the number 13, like we learned in previous Maamarim, because of the 13 midas shatorah dreshes behem, the 13 principles of Rabbi Shmuel. So you have davening, you have learning, both of them having to do with the Haroya B'Shoshanim connected to Anila Doidi, the idea of El. Yesh Lahois, if we could add, Shebeinyan, his gals, you'd give me the Sarachman. Pirish Alf B'Haroya B'Shoshanim, concerning the revelation of Yud Gimel Sarachmim, the first explanation in the Haroya B'Shoshanim. There's a big difference between the revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy in the month of Elul to the Gilu Yom Kippur. That's why we say the whole time throughout Yom Kippur, the Hashem Kiel Rachem V'Chanan, because then it's also a revelation of the 13 attributes. So what's the difference between Yom Kippur and El? One of the differences between them is she's galus you give me sarak Kippurim who ikir inyan doidi li shebola achre avoida danila doidi. The 13 attributes, that's the doidi li that comes after anila doidi. I did the anila doidi. Then we said doidi li comes Alter Rebbe and says is further on in the month of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is the doidi li. And primarily the doidi li, Hashem revealing himself to me, is those 13 attributes that are now revealed on Yom Kippur. So what's the Yud Gimel Midas of El? The Ilu is Gal Yud Gimel Sarachim Shebechodesh El, who inyan doidi li shen yonei la'oirer es ha'avoida danila doidi. There is a doidi li prior to the anila doidi. There is a one that comes before my avoida. The one for Yom Kippur is the doidi li that's a result of my anila doidi. The one in El that shines is the king in the field awakening me, so I should do anila doidi. The Hainu begins to that's the inspiration from above that inspires and awakens the inspiration from below. Which is similar to the idea of Torah, which Torah is also from above to below. Like the bread from heaven, like we said before. The Nimtza comes out, Shegam Inyan Yizgals Yud Gimel Sarachim Shebechodesh El Sheshayach Not Fila. Also the revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy in the month of El. That we said that has to do with davening. It's in such a manner it's connected with Torah because it's from above to below like Torah. Therefore, like we said before, when you have tefillah, the way it's impacted by Torah, so that tefillah is so much greater. So therefore, the davening is in a much higher way, like we said before in Ois Gimel. Now the Rebbe concludes with the brachas. This is the advantage of the month of El over the entire year. that its advantage is not just in davening, the first meaning of the one who's going to graze amongst the roses. Its advantage of the month of El is also the second meaning of going to graze amongst the roses, the idea of Torah. In the month of El, we must increase more with Torah study as well. Because the avoid of Torah learning is the avoid in the way of rest and peace. Especially through the study of Pnimis HaTorah, last page, the secrets. And the secrets of the Torah, the less there is no question and no dispute, including also spreading the well springs outward in ways of peace. In the pot of Shalom, through this we affect the ultimate and perfection of the idea of being redeemed in peace that we associate with Torah. But what that Torah going to bring, especially the Pnimis HaTorah, is going to bring the ultimate peace, the Mashiach Tzedkenu, and the true and complete redemption through Mashiach. Then we fulfill the promise, that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem, like the waters covers the sea. Also, knowledge having to do with the idea of Torah.